All right, let's dive in, shall we? Today's deep dive. It's a story that's pretty intense, really gets you thinking. King Herod, massacre of the innocents, and all that comes after.
Yeah, it's powerful stuff. It really sticks with you, even though it's, ancient history.
Right. I mean, we all know the basic story, but using these excerpts, we're going to try to dig deeper, like what was going on behind the scenes? Why did things happen the way they did? What does it mean for us now? All that.
I think it's fascinating how this story, even though it's so old, can still resonate with us today.
Okay, so first let's set the scene. Judea under Herod's rule.
Okay.
So Herod, he's known for those huge building projects, right?
hmm
But our sources, they really paint a picture of fear and brutality. Not exactly a fun guy to be around.
Oh, yeah. No, it was a very tense political climate back then.
Yeah.
You have to remember, Herod wasn't like a descendant of the Jewish kings or anything. He was appointed by Rome,
Oh,
which made his position really tricky. He was always trying to please the Jewish population, keep them happy, but at the same time, he had to stay on Rome's good side. It was a real balancing act.
and then on top of all that, he had threats from inside his own family. Like our sources mention how he actually had some of his own family members killed, just to make sure he kept his grip on power.
That's right. His paranoia was off the charts. He
Yeah.
saw enemies everywhere, even in his own household. Can you imagine
Yeah.
living with that kind of suspicion all the time, never knowing who you could trust?
Yeah, I mean, that really sets the stage for everything that's about to happen. And then we get to the arrival of the Magi.
The Magi.
Yeah, these mysterious figures from the east. They show up asking about a newborn king.
Right.
They're following a star, a sign of something huge, something that completely throws Herod's world upside down.
Oh, the irony there is pretty amazing. You've got Herod, this powerful king, totally obsessed with control, and then suddenly, boom, he's hit with this prophecy about a whole different kind of power, a power he can't control, can't manipulate.
Yeah, and you can almost feel the tension building, right? Our sources talk about how Herod and even all of Jerusalem were totally freaked out by the news of Jesus' birth.
I mean, think about the context. The Jewish people, they'd been waiting for the Messiah for centuries, a king to liberate them from Roman rule.
You're right.
So the idea of a newborn king of the Jews, huge deal. Could be exciting, could be really dangerous.
And for Herod, who had spent his whole reign fighting for his position, it was like a direct attack on everything he'd built.
Oh, absolutely. It triggered his worst fears.
Yeah.
I mean, he couldn't wrap his head around the idea that this newborn king wouldn't be a threat to his authority.
Yeah.
His paranoia basically led him down a dark path, a path that ended with a horrific decision to get rid of any possible rival.
And that decision led to the massacre of the innocents. Herod, out of pure desperation, orders the killing of all the boys under 2 years old in and around Bethlehem.
Just awful. It's a chilling reminder of just how cruel we humans can be, especially when we let fear and hunger for power take over. It really highlights this central paradox in Christianity, tragedy and sacrifice, they're kind of woven together with redemption. The sources, they don't shy away from how brutal the massacre was, but they also ask us to look for something deeper.
Yeah, and the Gospel of Matthew, the way it uses those words from the prophet Jeremiah to describe the grief, so powerful. A voice is heard in Ramah, lamentation and bitter weeping, Rachel weeping for her children, refusing to be comforted because they are no more.
It is heavy stuff. And that connection to Rachel, that figure from the Old Testament who also lost her children, it adds another layer, right? It ties this event
Yeah.
into this bigger story of suffering and loss that's like woven through all of human history.
Right, like grief and loss have always been there, and faith can help us find meaning, even in the darkest times.
Yeah, exactly. And amidst all this darkness, there's also a glimmer of hope, right? The Holy Family's escape to Egypt. Imagine that. The fear, the urgency, just running into the unknown. It says here, Joseph is woken up in the middle of the night by an angel.
Wow, the responsibility. They weren't just running for their own lives, they were carrying the future with them.
The angel tells Joseph that Herod is looking for the child, wants to kill him, says, get up, take the child and his mother and escape to Egypt. Stay there until I tell you.
Just a desperate flight, so much uncertainty.
And Egypt, right, the symbolism. It was a land of slavery for the Israelites, and now It becomes a safe haven for the Son of God. It's a total reversal.
It's powerful. God working in unexpected ways, turning what looks like defeat into a chance for salvation.
Okay, so let's talk about the holy innocents themselves. These children killed just because they happened to be born in Bethlehem at the wrong time. They have a special place in Christian tradition, right? Absolutely. They're considered proto-martyrs, the first to die for Christ. Their deaths, as awful as they foreshadow Jesus' own sacrifice years later, like a prelude to his story.
There's this quote from St. Augustine that I find really moving. He says, "The infants died for Christ, though they could not speak of Christ. Their bodies spoke for them." It says so much about suffering and sacrifice.
It's also about how even in their innocence, they were part of God's plan. Their deaths weren't meaningless. They became a testament to the cost of following Christ.
And the church remembers them specifically on December 28th, just a few days after Christmas. It's a day to reflect not just on the joy of Christ's birth, but also on the sorrow and sacrifice that are a part of it.
Right. It's a feast day that makes us think about the vulnerability of innocence, how fragile life is, and how powerful faith can be, even in the face of pure evil.
So, bringing this back to today, why does this story still matter now, so many centuries later?
It might be from ancient history, but this deep dives, it touches on some pretty timeless stuff. Power, injustice, protecting the vulnerable. It makes us look at our own world and how we respond to these issues.
Herod's fear, it led him to do some terrible things. It's a warning about what can happen when power goes unchecked, when we let fear control us. Looking around today, do you see any parallels? Fears, anxieties, pushing leaders to make bad choices.
Oh, definitely. It's a wake-up call. It reminds us to choose love over fear, compassion over cruelty, stand up for what's right, even when it's hard. It's about recognizing the dignity of every human life, no matter how small or insignificant it might seem.
The holy innocents, they're a stark reminder of what violence and hatred can do, especially towards those who are innocent. It makes you think about how we can protect the vulnerable in our communities and around the world.
Their story is also about the strength of the human spirit, the power of hope, even when facing unbelievable tragedy. Even in the darkest moments, faith and love can survive.
Yeah, it's like even when things seem impossible, they're telling us not to give up on hope. They never did. Even with everything stacked against them, never lost sight of what really mattered.
Their journey to Egypt, that says a lot about faith and resilience too.
Hmm.
Having the courage to trust, even when you don't know what's coming next.
I was just thinking about that. Their flight to Egypt, it's like the challenges so many people face today, right? Leaving behind violence, trying to find a safe place, having to start all over in a new country.
Definitely. Their story, it resonates with anyone who's ever been a refugee, been displaced,
Yeah.
throughout history and even now.
So we've covered a lot of ground here. It's a really complex story. Let's just recap the main points, kind of bring it all together. We talked about the dangers of unchecked power, what happens when fear takes over.
Yeah. And we talked about how powerful faith and obedience can be, even when you're dealing with like incredible hardship.
Right, and we were reminded that every human life is precious, especially the most vulnerable.
And I think the biggest takeaway from all of this is that message of hope, right? It's woven through this whole story. Even in the face of terrible evil, love and faith, not only can they survive, but they can show us a way forward.
The holy innocents, these innocent victims of a tyrant's rage, they've become these symbols of hope and resilience, showing us that light can exist even in the darkest places.
Yeah, it's like their story is proof that innocence, faith, and hope, they're stronger than we think. Even when there's so much suffering, light will always win out in the end.